Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yong Ye. I'm the co-moderator for this session. It is my honor to moderate this session with Her Excellency, Ms. Sherry Rehman, the Minister of Climate Change of Islamic Republic of Pakistan. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here for showcasing the Living Indus. This session takes the Living Indus program as a starting point, but it is intended to look at a broader aspect of resilience and adaptation, including climate financing. As you can note it in the agenda, we have great speakers today. Her Excellency, Ms. Sherry Rehman. We also have Mr. Yannick Glamaric, the Executive Director from the Global Climate Fund. Sit next to me is Ms. Suzanne Gardner, Director for Ecosystem Division and UN Environment. We also have Mr. Rain Paulson, the Director of the Office of Emergency and Resilience, the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations. We also joining us, we have Mr. Ronald Jackson, the Head of Disaster Reduction and Recovery for Building Resilience. To start with, I would like to request the Honorable Ms. Sherry Rehman to provide some background or remarks on the Living Indus before I invite the speakers to share their views on the Living Indus prospects, the challenges, and recommendations for guiding the next step of actions. We will conclude this session with our closing remarks after we have the Q&A session with speakers. Now, let us welcome Ms. Sherry Rehman.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, co-chair Yong Ye, fellow speakers. I really appreciate afternoon attendance and focus on one of Pakistan's, and to me, the most important adaptation project that has the capacity to transform futures in Pakistan. Now, this morning, if any of you have been attending the plenary or have heard about the great 2022 floods in Pakistan, you will have heard that Pakistan is situated in one of the largest floodplains of the world. Now, the Indus River is part of that floodplain. It is one of the world's largest rivers for Pakistan. It is a virtual lifeline, and the jugular through which Pakistan has articulated most of its civilization, its culture, and bred life in many forms, both within the river and outside it, for over 5,000 years. It was known, Pakistan is part of an ancient civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization. So this great river is a nourisher. It is called in indigenous culture as a mother of Pakistan. It changes from the north to the south, where it goes into the delta, many colors, many faces, and it is home to a huge ecology of marine life, one of them being the rare blind dolphin, which we are seeking to revive, and yet has become one of the fourth most polluted rivers in the world. This project was conceived as a great regrowing or rehabilitation of a living Indus, of making the Indus alive again. It still roars from the north when it comes down. It's called the Lion River in the north, and we have one of the largest, well, actually we have the largest amount of glaciers, very, very majestic, very stunning, in the north of Pakistan. This is where the Indus flows the hardest and the fastest and comes down as a mountain river from a large tower of water, literally, in the north of this region, and that powers many of the great rivers of the region. The Indus is one of them, and it is home to Pakistan's life, both agricultural and otherwise. 80 to 90% of human settlement has clustered around this, and it's like all great civilizations, come up around this river. Now, as I mentioned, instead of being the fountain of Pakistan's ecology, it is under severe stress from human activity, from anthropogenic crises that we see all around us, effluence, corporations dumping unchecked, and the inability to govern such a vast area, along with a growing a flood pattern that is beginning to now become more and more amplified and more troublesome for those that live near the area or who have grown life around that area. One of the reasons that the Indus goes into flood are the heat waves that we have been speaking about and we see as a climate-induced disaster. And for Pakistan, 2022 was a bellwether year. It brought cascades of 4 successive heat waves, which impacted the Indus River in the north very early, very egregiously, by tripling the amount of glacial lake outburst floods. Now, any of you who are studying mountain communities or mountain ecologies will know that these are very dangerous floods, and these occur around melting glaciers. They form pools of icy lakes, and when it is hot weather is recurring, these lakes then burst and they flow out in a torrent of very angry water that then destroys infrastructure, human life, settlements, whatever stands in their way. Some of our flooding videos, maybe we don't have those, we have a different presentation today, show how this kind of flooding of the glacial lake outburst takes down boulders, bridges, like toothpicks in its way. I mean, so the whole business of building back better becomes a challenge in areas that are flooding more and more as heat escalates every year, as it amplifies every year. So global warming is becoming a yearly challenge for Pakistani communities living in the north, and then it becomes a death-like embrace for those living in the south, the delta of the river, which is from the province I am, and which is called Sindh. It is the southernmost province, and it is the one that is deluged right now. And the great flood brought with it, it inundated 1/3 of Pakistan. Much of it was from a monsoon, and not the river, but the 2010 river floods were from the river Indus, which as temperatures heat up, starts bursting its banks, and either it is in a state of complete drought when the crop season is needed just before, in the delta areas, just before the monsoon seasons, which is bang in the middle of a June-July summer, or it is in high flood, endangering communities, life, infrastructure, and pretty much everything as we know it in the country. So while it is a giver of life, it has also been it is also offered a cascade of threats. It is we as humans that have caused this. The river is out of balance. The river needs its life back. It needs to be recharged. It needs a number of solutions, nature-based, small, community-centered, inclusive, and large infrastructure projects to actually start working with the storm drains. Those are built into our RF framework that is going on in the other room as part of a larger pledging conference. But storm drains from this river, the ecology of this river, community ponds around it, the plastic clogging it, the effluent that flows into the river, the heat waves that cause erratic flows and hydromet events that then we cannot control or predict, are a great risk, not just to the river, but to the populations that have lived off it for centuries. So now I'm going to quickly run a presentation, if I may, around this project that grew with, in partnership with the UN and the FAO to recharge the Indus. We have designed a living menu of 25 interventions, big and small, that would help this great river to, if it spoke, for instance, it would say, I need to live again. And this river has a life of its own. We need to give it its lungs back. Now, here's I've already said some of this. You can see that more than 80% of Pakistan's arable land is irrigated by its waters. It runs as a huge jugular vein through the country, defining civilization as well as agriculture and obviously manufacturing too, because all the cities are clustered around it. 9 out of the 10 largest cities in Pakistan are situated within 50 kilometers or less of the waters of the Indus, the one exception being Quetta. But this can be a disadvantage also to the Indus. It's an advantage to the populations living around it, because great rivers feed entire populations. And that disadvantage is that once manufacturing and urban centers start teeming and spreading in their urban sprawl, they then begin casting all of their waste into the river in the hope that it will flow away. Well, it's not going to flow anywhere. Everything, as you know, comes right back, and nature has its great circularity, which regenerates, but it also can choke on its own effluent. The next slide, please. Yes, it's, as I mentioned, documented to support life for over 5,000 years. Today, parts of the Indus look like this. I grew up around this area, and in summer, it was so strong, even in Sindh, in the Delta region, in July, that you would cross the bridge. It's called the Kotri Bridge. You would cross the bridge with a little fear in your heart that these waves, these great waves, could envelop the tiny cars creeping along it. And I remember one of our vehicles falling into that river. The people were saved, but the vehicle was totaled. So it used to be a great stormy river. Now, in summer, it looks like that. It's desertified. And in the north, it's raging. Please, next slide. Here's the physical map of the subcontinent. We are only talking about this project within the boundaries of Pakistan. And I mentioned that we are, of course, one of the topmost countries that are vulnerable to climate change. Not a good index to be in, but it is what it is. And this project represents the interventions on it. 15 of the 25 actually will address flooding. The rest are other adaptation projects. It is also a great carbon sink. So we feel that this is, for us, an axis of adaptation. It is the kind of series of interventions that we need. And the good thing is that it is built, it's projectized as an inclusive system. It is built with all the federating units, the provinces as stakeholders, but more importantly, the communities who live around the river. So it's been conceived as a stakeholder, citizens' involvement, community-based project. It'll involve half of Pakistan, because half of Pakistan lives off the Indus. So there we are. Can we keep going, or we are done? So it flows from two sources: the poor health of the basin. I've spoken to you about this. The degradation of soil, poor infrastructure, disruption of rainfall, changing climate, and unsustainable use of resources. The growing demand for action has come from the communities and from people who are more and more conscious of our relationship with nature and the importance of regenerating our resources, and how much we kind of, with poor planning or governance, climate governance, environmental governance, we damage our most vital resources. Because if your ecosystem starts degrading, then there is very little time between that and the human race being challenged, as I'm sure the younger people know. So that's where we are. Are we next? This is an umbrella initiative, now goes into the call to action and projectization. We have had extensive consultations with the public sector. Look at me sharing your screen. And private sector experts and civil society, and the living menu. These are in line with global best practices, and they focus mostly on green infrastructure and nature-based approaches. These are less expensive, but based on the proposed targets, we will require between $11 billion to $17 billion over the next 5 to 15 years. Now, this project was conceived before. There are hyperlinks to explain which particular interventions you want to see. This project was conceived before the Great Flood of 2022. The flood is now from in the other room, mopping up every available resource that either Pakistan generates or international development partners and bilateral donors and friends of Pakistan generate. So conceivably, what would have gone into this great axis of adaptation project is now already going into rebuilding what was destroyed in Pakistan over exactly what we were predicting. But none of us could predict a monsoon, a flood from the sky, which just goes to tell us that climate change can eat up our planning, our resources, and all management of risk as we see it. If there are any questions, there's a short video. Could we run that? Is not on, is it?
Okay, it's delayed. And your presentation described very well the importance of Indus River to Pakistan from the social, economic, cultural, and historical point of view. Unfortunately, Indus River, as described by the minister, is very vulnerable to the climate change. And nowadays, the Indus River basin is facing a lot of challenges in the age of the climate change. So I appreciate the government leadership and efforts in initiating the Living Indus program in collaboration with UN agencies. You have seen that 25 interventions have been identified under the program, which were prioritized, costed, with identified links to the SDGs and NDC's national defined contribution, as well as the contribution to the flood resilience. Community engagement and PPP potentials were also assessed. Next step is to translate this initiative into actions. I would say it is more prominent in the context of the flood response implementation of the 4RF, and rebuilding a resilient Pakistan. So I have two questions for the Honorable Minister. First, can you tell us about the context and also the planned action to address climate resilience in Pakistan, including the conceptualization of the Living Indoors program? Second is what the government of Pakistan's resource mobilization strategy for the climate resilience.
Thank you, Excellency. I think part of your question's been answered in the sense that I have set out in quite a bit of detail how this project was conceived and why. Clearly, Pakistan is in need of adaptation. It is also conceived as a mitigation project, but given the scale of and magnitude of climate crises afflicting frontline countries like Pakistan, which this year was literally the ground zero for climate inaction across the world, it is now, it was really conceived a little late in my view. Late in the sense that now as we start building towards it, if I may collapse both your questions, as we start building towards projectizing it further or actually building the financial pipelines that will create a menu of blended finance as well as development assistance, what we see is a paucity or a clear deficit of climate funds, of green funding, of development funding that can be diverted into this kind of project. So, excuse me, while we built it before the flood, the $16 billion that are being talked about are just storm drains, will not even address the big storm drains of the river, for instance. There is something called the left bank outfall drain, which will need by itself $2 billion, not addressed in the 4RFs because we don't have that scale of funding to reach out for donors. It will be cascaded. It will be part of a menu of resilience actions. But as I emphasized this morning, funding is key to building or any kind of clear project pathway. Right now, the first step needed is a small fund to kickstart its the technical capacity and the consultations needed. Very short time span. I don't foresee more than 3 to 6 months in projectizing and building, say, 8 of these that have been prioritized as first line, initiatives that can be taken to build resilience. So we have, prioritized some big ones, some small ones. Investors can pick, say, the community ponds, which is small investment, nature-based, community-based, or they can pick the big intervention, which is intervening in the detoxification and reducing of pollution of the river. But there is an array of interventions that can be made and also need to be, at this point, put into a bankable development project that can speak to immediately moving some of these initiatives forward. So that's where we stand at the moment. No, Pakistan's government is overstretched right now to the maximum in terms of human, hardware, infrastructure, and financial capacity. After a flood that cost us $30 billion, as you saw in the other room, 16 billion of losses and economic losses and damages, the rest. So it comes to about 30 billion. It's a drag on our GDP. We have 20 million still affected. So money is going, it's all getting repurposed, even climate resilience money, to humanitarian needs. My fear is that this will recur. Some kind of climate-induced disaster will occur next summer. We'll still be meeting. We'll still be in a recovery trap. How do then adaptation and mitigation projects even get the attention, focus, or resource they deserve? That's a question I want to throw out to you all. No,
okay. Yes, indeed. I think the climate change financing, also the financing requirement for whatever our response to the climate change is huge. It's probably way beyond the Pakistan itself can meet. So the way, I think one of the value for this report is to, like Minister said, to come up with interventions which prioritized and tailor-made for different kind of financiers. ADB also stand ready to support the Pakistan in accessing the expanding international global climate finance market. So maybe let's turn around and maybe I would request Susan Gardner, the Director for Ecosystem Division and UN Environment, to make her remarks. While you are making the remarks, I have also some questions for you to consider. Because for the Living Indus program, the program calls for the ecosystem-based or nature-based solutions. What are the linkages between the ecosystem revitalization programs and the disaster risk reduction from your perspective? And how can the nature-based solution be delivered and scale? And what are the key lessons or learned from the world internationally?
Well, let me just say, first of all, it's an honor to be here. And Minister, delivering remarks on behalf of our UNEP Executive Director, Inger Anderson, who, as you know, she was committed to be here, and unforeseen circumstances have not permitted that, but she remains committed, as she had described to you when you met with her last. And she hopes to make a visit to Pakistan very, very soon in the near future. I'm certain that if she could hear your passion and your hope for what is possible if we all work together, and the extraordinary images in that video that show us what is at stake for the people and the landscapes, that she would be even more inspired to ensure that she continues with this commitment. As we saw in these devastating floods of 2022, Pakistan and the Indus Basin are at the front lines of climate change, and we heard that very clearly this morning in the various comments. And this is an area that's also in the front line of nature and biodiversity loss. It's on the front line of pollution and waste crisis. So this is about addressing the triple planetary crisis that is inseparable, that is all together, by easing planetary pressures and building resilience to climate change. And nature-based solutions are solutions that we know work, and they're very cost-effective, and they are necessary. We don't we don't achieve progress on the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, without involving the full potential of nature to build in resilience and adaptation. So they're fully linked. This initiative, the Living Indus initiative, is a complement to this, and as well as with the 4R framework. It's the kind of forward-looking approach that we know is needed. The initiative really is built on an understanding that what has worked before in terms of infrastructure, or agriculture, whether that's finance or something else, it's not going to continue to work in a warming world. We heard that from the Secretary General, we heard that from the Prime Minister, that business as usual is no longer an option. And this initiative also understands that we need to invest more in adaptation to deal with the climate impacts, the impacts that were acknowledged at COP27 by the global community, by agreeing to new approaches on loss and damage that are more and more important in terms of the urgency of responding and getting more progress on that at COP28. And UNEP's very pleased to see in the initial consultations of the initiative that there was a menu of interventions that have been produced that focus on nature-based solutions, that focus on ecosystem-based adaptation approaches and resilience of infrastructure for addressing and anticipating future floods and groundwater discharge. But we do want to emphasize that this is going to work when we deliver these interventions and involving every actor. So every province and every minister all of the UN system, the private sector, civil society, and academia, we all have to work together, of course, with the communities that are living and depending on the river and its boundaries. And so this Living Indus initiative is something that is built into its work, is collaboration and integration, and the solutions will also contribute to the much needed work of the biodiversity framework and delivering on the rights to a healthy environment. So these are all interconnected, and we see very positive signs already in terms of a whole of government and a whole of society approach so far. UNEP has provided support. The UN system has shown promise in the conversations today and further under the leadership of the UNRC, with special thanks to FAO. And UNEP, of course, will continue to play our part. At your request, Minister, UNEP as a Green Climate Fund accredited entity will provide support through an investment framework that envisions space for all actors. And with your indulgence, I would like to invite my colleague Jessica Troney to make some remarks and give more information and technical presentation that provides more details on this framework. But I just want to say, in closing on my remarks, we're very grateful to the initial interest by the GCF in this initiative. We're very pleased that we're having that opportunity to have this conversation with you today. Yes, there is much work to do under the initiative, and there will be very difficult choices ahead. We all know that. Choices on legal and institutional reforms, land tenure, agriculture, much more. But these difficult choices will be worth it because the Living Indus initiative will help us to create a healthy, thriving, climate-resilient basin if we all get it behind it and work together. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just to follow on from Susan, so Minister Rahman requested our Executive Director's support to implement the Living Indus initiative. So we fielded a mission in December, and we will continue supporting a development of a concept for the Green Climate Fund. I just want to present to you the outlines of that concept and would welcome feedback on it, including from Minister Rahman. So just to say that we're here for the terrible floods that happened last summer, but Pakistan actually is feeling many diverse impacts, from warming to glacial melt, to droughts, to sea level rise. It's a huge country that spans, as Mr. Rahman said, from the Himalayas in the north to mangroves in the south. So it's feeling a range of hazards, and the Indus Initiative interventions will mitigate many of these hazards, if not all of them. So just to give you an example, warming, projected temperature increases in Pakistan, regularly over 38 degrees in many places, and warming much faster than the average. By 2100, at the higher level of emissions, Pakistan could warm to over 5 degrees average annually, relative to over 3 degrees globally. 126 heat waves have been experienced between 1997 and 2015, an average of 7 per year. Drought frequency, an annual probability of between 25 to 65% and severe drought across Pakistan. Large areas of Pakistan have transitioned to zones which are chronically drought affected. Rainfall actually has decreased by 10 to 15% on average since 1960, but at the same time, what we're seeing is heavy rainfall events and flooding. The 2022 floods were the worst, but there have been floods in 2011, 2012, 2014. And by 2030 to 35 to 2044, it's estimated that an additional 5 million people annually would be affected by extreme river flooding. So these are impacts that are here to stay and will become worse. Glacial melt, it's really frightening. 60% of the water that Pakistan needs comes from glacial melt and snowing. but temperature increases in the northern parts of the country are increasing, as I mentioned earlier, much faster than global average. And black carbon deposition on glaciers, I don't know if you've seen what that looks like, is increasing. It's producing a negative feedback loop. So all of these effects are deeply disturbing for Pakistan's growth. So the Indus Initiative really is about a series of interventions, 25, that are meant to combat these hazards. But alongside that, as Minister Rahman mentioned, there are many socio-economic drivers of vulnerability. And one of the things that struck me as I did a little bit of research is that the evidence is not easy to find. The evidence of how these socio-economic drivers of vulnerability are impacting on climate resilience is not easy to find. So that is something that we need to improve. For example, land degradation, desertification, dryland expansion linked to overgrazing, overexploitation of water resources and cultivation, leading to loss of topsoil and sedimentation. Water scarcity increasing. Marginal non-agricultural land brought into arable use through water diversion schemes, and agriculture accounting for 95% of water withdrawals, groundwater being polluted and so on. So there are many issues, many drivers that are impacting on vulnerability levels to climate change, and then you have climate change. So when I was putting together the figures on adaptation needs and current funding projects, it struck me that actually there was a huge difference. So in the Pakistan NDC 2021, there's an adaptation cost of $7 to $14 billion, as well as loss and damage estimates. And the one that's being presented today in this conference is $16 billion. When you look at externally funded adaptation or resilience building projects, it comes to a figure of 768 million, including co-financing. And of those, 9 projects are GCF funded, as well as a few government-funded resilience building measures. So the main message here is that the investment going into resilience building and adaptation is much lower than the estimated needs are. Improving governance is an important part of the solution. The country's planning systems and institutions need investment. We need investment in coordination, in collaboration, in human capacities, spatial planning, optimizing the use of natural resources, developing regulations, standards, fiscal frameworks, monitoring and enforcement. Entrenched development models. There's a familiarity and experience of built approaches to flood management and growth, but there are many unintended consequences which erode resilience. And again, I wasn't able to find very much evidence about that, but it did become clear in many conversations that we had when we were in Pakistan in December. And of course, the macroeconomic situation makes domestic resources for adaptation very difficult. So this is, from many conversations that we had in December, this is the kind of conceptualization that we are proposing for the Living Indus Initiative. What we're proposing is to access the simplified access approval window in the Green Climate Fund, which allows a project of up to $25 million, as long as it's a low-risk category project. We're proposing a concept that leads with a financial mechanism as the centerpiece to promote collaboration across institutions and between federal government and the provinces. It pulls in various of the Indus Initiative investment priorities within a legal and policy setting. We're calling this financial mechanism an ecosystem restoration fund, which provides de-risking tools to encourage international private investments in ecosystem restoration, climate resilient agriculture, forestry, and renewable energy, working with national institutions to reach beneficiaries. We're proposing the legal and institutional framework to be established through an Indus Protection Act that would confer legal rights and govern the Indus Basin's overall planning of land and water resources, pollution management, rehabilitation of ecology, following examples in China and New Zealand. We're proposing to take this down to the provincial level with downscaled living index plans, legal and policy frameworks designed to mitigate the multi-climate hazard profile in that particular province. We're proposing to work in one urban area to design and implement city-level adaptation plans to mitigate the multi-climate hazards profile. For example, green areas to absorb floodwater, improve groundwater recharge, and reduce heat island temperatures. This includes implementing measures to address pollution and impacts on water resources, because polluted water makes domestic water scarcer, and unmanaged waste leads to flood risk through blockages and drainage lines. And finally, the idea is to frame all of this with improved governance at provincial and city level through land zoning, water abstraction regulation, water quality standards, fiscal instruments, and so on, and building a citizen movement through a digital platform that disseminates information, collects information, builds awareness. In this way, we would invest in 15 of the 25 Indus Initiative intervention areas and create a programmatic framework in which others can invest. And finally, what would this ecosystem restoration fund look like? Well, we don't know, but there are options. We have, UNEP is partnered with Rabobank, Dutch Development Bank, and IDH, Sustainable Trade Initiative, to design an Agri-3 fund, which provides credit enhancement tools such as guarantees and technical assistance to pull in private investment into sustainable land management and deforestation-free agriculture. Another one is a restoration seed capital facility. This supports early-stage development of forest restoration projects. These are conditional grants that are reimbursable once the business reaches maturity. And we have partnered with the German and Luxembourg governments to develop this fund. And the other one that we're looking into is carbon offset mechanisms. Also to say that I'm aware that there is a sovereign bond that is being worked on at the moment, and this kind of framework and investment could be scaled up through these green bond investments, and I'm led to believe that there are private investors that are already quite interested to invest in this kind of instrument. So as I said, UNEP over the course of 2023 will be providing resources to develop this funding proposal, and we look forward to discussing this further with the Green Climate Fund. Thank you.
Paulson to make his remarks. Since we want to keep some time for the Q&A with the audience, so I would request you keep your remarks within like 3 to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, distinguished co-chair, and thank you, Excellency, Minister, for the opportunity to share a few thoughts today. And before I do that, on behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, let me just start by commending the government of Pakistan on its leadership, not just in developing this particular initiative that we're speaking about in the parallel session, but also for the work that it's been leading in really igniting global efforts to pay attention to climate change impacts. And those of you that have been listening to the interventions this morning, and the interventions indeed that are going on now, I know are being reminded of just how deeply this is felt by many stakeholders and important that it is as well. And as stressed by many of the participants in today's conference, the impact of these monster floods as they were described last summer are tragically not just going to be felt today, but likely to be felt for some time into the future. And this must surely be a collective wake-up call to the world about these life-changing, life-threatening effects of the climate crisis. Vital, therefore, that we take this opportunity and every opportunity to redouble our efforts in a different way to rebuild, to recover, to reinforce resilience. And in this case, resilience of Pakistan's communities, resilience of the agri-food systems in Pakistan, and of the economy in the face of continuing climate threats. Looking to the future, We continue, of course, to find ways to support the life-saving work that needs to take place, the livelihoods recovery work that needs to take place. But as the Minister was indicating in opening comments, vital that we use every opportunity now to simultaneously build resilience and readiness to secure the lasting prosperity of the country and its people. And indeed, long before the floods struck, the government and its partners, including FAO and including, I know colleagues here on the panel, has been working on efforts to strengthen climate resilience. And these indeed have been cemented in this Living Indus initiative, demonstrated in this Living Indus initiative that is the focus of the parallel discussion. On the Food and Agriculture Organization side, we are proud and honored to have been able to work closely with the government under the coordination of the resident coordinator, together with our sister agencies in the UN, including, of course, colleagues at UNEP, in providing technical assistance, technical guidance to inform the development of this initiative. Parenthetically, let me say UNEP and FAO, of course, are also co-leading the United Nations Decade on Ecosystems Restoration, and I have no doubt under the leadership of the government and the leadership of Her Excellency the Minister that this Living Indus initiative will be an excellent example of practically how this type of work and collaboration can take place on the ground. The initiative, of course, recognizes the critical importance of the Indus Basin, and we've heard that in compelling relief presented today in all its different ecosystems, from the mountains and glaciers to rangeland, forest, arable lands for the population and economy, and indeed also culture of Pakistan. Efficient water use and effective water resources management are at the heart of the solution to build resilience in Pakistan, and this is why FAO is focusing precisely on this area of improving management of these water resources within the agricultural sectors as part of its priority collaboration with the government. Indeed, this is a collaboration that extends back decades, focused on improving the agricultural sectors. And I would mention just very quickly, in the interest of time, two major programs that contribute to achieving the initiative goals. And let me, as I'm doing that, just acknowledge the funding provided by colleagues at the Green Climate Fund, which is co-financing an FAO-implemented climate water management program together with the governments of provincial governments of Punjab and Sindh under the coordination of the Ministry of Climate Change. It's a program that focuses on on-farm water management practices, on practical climate resilience techniques, and supports both federal and provincial governments in developing policies that facilitate climate resilience and this all-important improved water management that I've referred to already. Through this program, FAO is supporting efforts to build climate resilience across provincial boundaries and across technical departments. And we often talk about the nexus when it comes to humanitarian and development programming, but indeed a nexus mentality across administrative entities is vital for success in this context. Ultimately, some 1.3 million people in vulnerable areas of the Indus River Basin will see improved yields and increased returns of between 30 to 80% in their production. And as many as 16 million people will indirectly benefit as a result. The second program that I would mention quickly, funded by the European Union, is focused on reviving water resources in Balochistan, seeking to harness the province's limited water resources and ensure their smarter use, again focused on use in agriculture. But this is alongside other key interventions, and in this case alongside activities to improve rangeland management for livestock rearing. Ensuring the lasting success of climate resilience stands and falls fundamentally on our collective ability to engage with local communities, understanding their needs, their priorities, enhancing their skills and knowledge to enable them to own and indeed lead the transformation and adaptation of their own livelihoods. And this is precisely why FAO in its approaches focuses on training of extension workers, on support and engagement with farmer facilitators, to lead in training farmers and supporting them on improved production practices, which build on local knowledges and skills, leveraging that to the full extent possible. FAO remains committed to supporting the government of Pakistan in building climate resilient, prosperous agri-food systems across all the provinces of Pakistan, to continuing our work in providing technical guidance and on-the-ground interventions across the nexus that I referred to on the humanitarian and development side. Finally, the success of the Living Indus initiative depends, of course, on being fully able to raise the resources needed. And I was struck, Excellency, by your comment at the outset around how do we collectively ensure that while adequate attention is given to the things that are being discussed in plenary, that we ensure that the right type of attention is also supporting the vision and the implementation behind this longer-term initiative that's fundamental for transformation. So these 25 interventions, you've heard the amounts that are required. It's vital that this money is secured. If not, the cost will be much higher. This initiative will save lives. It will restore productive ecosystems, including the wonderfully named Mother River of Pakistan, the Indus, and increase and protect food production. So thank you very much for this opportunity. You can count on our support.
Yeah, thank you, Rain. Maybe we can move forward. We have only like 5 minutes, so Rick and Rona, the gentlemen, to maybe share your remarks, and please do keep some time for the interaction with the audience, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Noting the time first, also let me add my voice, expressing the honor to join you on the panel to reflect on the journey beyond the 2022 floods. I also want to commend the government of Pakistan and the UN system for its leadership and collaboration, and in particular you, Minister, for this particular initiative, which represents, certainly in our eyes, the connect between global policy and strategic actions on the one hand, and effective localization on the other hand. You know, far too often, we see this gap between global policy setting and bringing this down to local level. So commendations there. Certainly, as we reflect a little bit on this issue of the Indus, one of the things we take into consideration that it has been proven that ecological degradation in an area increases its vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. And I think you've brought that out quite strongly in your opening remarks, and certainly in your presentation. And in the context of Pakistan, ecological revival under this particular initiative is intrinsically linked to climate change adaptation and resilience building. Ecosystems-based adaptation and nature-based solutions are key for addressing climate change, exacerbated floods, extreme temperatures, droughts, coastal erosion that is being experienced in the country. And certainly I think it provides a value proposition, a sort of macro result where you can actually see the impact of some investment without major investment in hard infrastructure. I think that's one of the positive outcomes of the Indus approach. The recovery needs of Pakistan floods have not only considered the damage stemming from the floods, but have also identified initiatives to enhance nature capital in the most impacted and high-risk areas. Recovery efforts also aim to strengthen governance capacities, which are critical to provide environmental oversight in the reconstruction process. You've noted the 25 interventions planned therein. 23 are directly linked to increasing resilience to climate change. And these interventions, such as improvements in risk knowledge, monitoring and early warning systems for glacial lake outburst floods, GLOF2, will protect and prevent loss of lives and livelihoods in the provinces close by. The interventions are to protect coastal ecosystems in flood-affected Sindh and Baluchistan provinces are key to prevent biodiversity loss, as you've heard before. There are also interventions that will help local fishing and farming communities use sustainable practices to adapt to climate change. As we think about resilience, I think it's important that we consider the communities in the center of any resilience building process. They're at the front line of the effects of these challenges and are at the front line of the actions to address some of these challenges. And of course, we note it is the poorest and most marginal groups that are affected and bearing the brunt in this process. Everywhere where we've worked as UNDP and the UN by extension, we've seen indigenous knowledge bringing solutions that are environment friendly and use locally available resources. And in fact, indigenous peoples are stewards of the world's biodiversity and cultural diversity. They have been caretakers of the environment, protecting land and respecting wildlife and utilizing traditional knowledge passed down through generations. So a part of our efforts forward must seek to bring this indigenous knowledge into the frame in advancing the Living Indus initiative. As I reflect a little bit on the work of UNDP, I want to know that there are several initiatives in the country that are already working in alignment with the objectives of the Living Indus initiatives. For instance, in a program to regenerate forests and local ecosystems, UNDP is supporting provincial governments to develop and implement measures to conserve biodiversity, protect ecosystems and natural resources while ensuring communities and youth have access to sustainable livelihoods. In Khyber, Sindh, help me here, Minister,
Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, just say KP.
KP, Sindh, and Punjab provinces, sustainable forest management practices, mangrove restoration efforts, and forest conservation efforts have begun to show distinct results. In the three provinces, forest conservation has increased the number of species of hog deer, partridge, bear, and gray langur in an area of 15,000 hectares. Over 400,000 mangrove seeds have been planted across 100 hectares of coastal area in Balochistan. UNDP's flood recovery programs will also provide renewed technical assistance to build capacities, conduct flood risk assessments, and reduce landslides in the glacial lake outburst. In closing, I think it is important that as we consider the journey forward and the cost associated with building resilience, that we see a collective UN investment being brought together within the context of tools such as the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. I think it will require all of the UN systems investment in supporting the journey forward, and certainly UNDP is standing ready to contribute in that regard. Three key messages as I leave you on resilience. One, we must ensure a multi-risk approach rather than siloing on climate and disaster resilience by fostering multi-stakeholder and multi-sector collaboration. Two, strengthening the collaboration between the humanitarian development and peace-building actors is critical. We've heard that in the pledges that we've going on in the other room. And thirdly, emphasizing on vulnerability and exposure reduction. I think that is fundamentally important if we are to be successful in this particular journey. Thank you very much, Minister and colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Roland Jackson, and thank you for your remarks. I noted, I agree that for the resilience, you talk about breaking the silo collaborations and also involve all different stakeholders as well. So we are now coming to the end of the speaker's remarks. So with the permission of the Honorable Minister, we can extend the session for about like 10 minutes. 5 minutes. So maybe we can entertain one question only before I hand over the floor to the, okay, you please.
My name is Sufi Lagari. I'm originally from Sindh. I have a question and comments and recommendation. Sindh is suffering more than any other province, not only because of climate change, but corruption, negligence, and inefficiency of Pakistan People's Party, which they have ruled 14 years continuously. And I walk from New York to Washington, 350 miles. I walked last year, and I walked 2021, 424 kilometers from Toronto to Ottawa against the climate change and for the human rights. Pakistan People's Party, now if you look in the Sindh province, what is the condition of their over-the-ground realities? How many times are you going to begging from the other countries? Sindh is the richest country, part of the country. Human rights condition, blasphemy laws. If only Pakistan cut the military budget to give the education and health and climate change, half of your problem will be resolved, especially the girls' education. Madam Shari Rahman, you know better than me because you are on the ground. I'm crying. I'm working hard for my family. Your parties killed my brother. No investigation. United Nations asked. Climate change. So my recommendation only one, if you cut the budget of the Pakistani military, your half problem will be resolved. Thank you very much.
Mic is still on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the governance is an important aspect as we all discussed when we talk about the 4F, when we talk about the disaster recovery and resilience issues. And yes, I think your recommendation is heard. I don't know whether you want to address this question to.
Of course I do. Of course I do. But I also want to address some of the remarks made earlier by panelists, co-panelists. Mr. Lagari, our deep sympathies for your brother. I'm not aware of which death or passing you're speaking of. We always stand humbled in the face of tragedy, especially when you think it's externally caused. I'm not at all aware of which incident. You may want to bring it to me. But, you know, I think we can broaden the focus of our discussions to all South Asian economies, the political economies of resistance and change, and address a number of governance deficits and political deficits that may pose barriers to the kind of conversation we're talking about, or to the progress in this conversation. So I do understand your views and appreciate your walking for the climate. Activists always are a little, they need anger to spur action. So yes, I think that is understandable, but let's not chase down one crisis and conflate it with another. Right now, particularly, Yannick of the Green Climate Fund is walking in, and I have stuff to say to you. Good stuff. Yeah. Oh, really? Okay. So I'm very glad he's made it. Now, you know, we've been speaking in the other session, and you're very right to say Sindh is very afflicted. And for instance, the left bank outfall drain, which is not mentioned in the recovery plan because there just isn't enough bandwidth for it in this kind of cascade of priorities, should be in there. It's just too much right now. Its design is poor. It hasn't been able to meet its needs, and it's half built. So we do need, and it's one of the largest actual storm drains in this great river. So that needs $2 billion. Now, yes, of course, there are governance deficits. We are here to discuss those. But we are here primarily to meet the needs of a century-breaking climate event. One of the members here mentioned floods earlier in Pakistan. Yes, we had a super flood in 2010. To just put in perspective, that was 20 million people affected. The world did a heavy lift on the ground, in the air, in the water, and of course also with development resources. Other than today, we haven't seen that amount of lift. We are very grateful to our partners, and today in the other room, we've seen a huge breakout of support. And we will tally that up and thank everyone appropriately. But this has been 33 million in one go. Nobody predicted, no amount of risk modeling, weather patterning, anything. Yes, we are now told there can be better weather predictors, and we need to invest in those. We're talking about those. Our NDMA is here to talk about those. But could have predicted the 1 month or 6 weeks of uninterrupted deluge from the sky that Sindh and some parts of Balochistan saw. So, yeah, I don't think it's only about poor governance. Every country's had a share in that. But what we saw in Pakistan, as the Secretary General says, was climate carnage he has not seen before. Him and UNOCHA have been everywhere, wherever there's been a climate or weather disaster. They have not seen anything like it. In terms of even our last flood, that was 20 million affected. This was 33 million. The size of, population size of 3 medium-sized European countries. Please, get a grip. There are still 20 million in need. We have moved every available resource to feed, shelter, provide just water, penicillin, all the 19th century requirements of survival. I said this morning, this flood brought us straight into 3 centuries. There were people living lives of hard scrabble poverty in the winter just now as we speak. 8 million are still living next to water. They are not going back to lives of comfort, shelter, or predictability as we understand it, let alone incomes and schools or online facilities that we at least were able to use during the pandemic. This is not one of those crises. This has created an arc of vulnerability in the province you speak of, which has transformed the topography of the area. It will not go back to what it was. The 100-kilometer lake that I just came from Khairpur to Dadu, is not moving for a long time. The millions that fed off that soil will not have a livelihood. And yes, we may be able to recalibrate all the budgets we want, but anger is not a plan. And I always say, we spoke in the morning that hope is important to spur action, but hope also must come with a plan. It must. And this morning we've been presenting what is hailed as a recovery plan that is fairly detailed, meets only, let me be very clear, first cascade needs, first line responses, not climate resilience as we see it. It is basic flood resilience. That's it. It's not climate resilience. We don't have the bandwidth for the urgent planning right now for it, or let me say the resource envelope. Neither do our development partners. But we have to first target what we can. In mentioning, somebody here mentioned 38 degrees. I think it was you, Ms. Gardner? Or, well, no. We were 53 point something degrees this summer. We are the hottest place on the planet for the last 3 years, and it is only getting higher and higher. These temperatures are not made for human, I'm so glad you don't have to walk there, human habitation. They're not. For cultivation, for manufacturing, for industrial use, nothing. And it has created a clear soil deficit, a river that went into drought. I mean, this Indus that is now flooded was bone dry in the delta. If you were living in Pakistan, you saw the newspapers or traveled through that terrain, it was an axis of complete parched earth. At that time, it was our mango orchards, all of that was gone. So while we were just talking about this came the monsoon from the sky. Now, South Asia is no stranger to monsoons. All of South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, where the great tower of water from the Hindu Kush Karakoram ranges comes down, is very familiar with monsoons. Our entire range of film songs is based around romanticizing the monsoon because it brings relief. Our crops need it. This was a monsoon from hell. This was no monsoon. This was a deluge from the sky. And again, be glad you weren't living then in more salubrious climates where climate activism and walks are possible. There is no walk possible in 53 degrees centigrade. Coming back to UNEP, I do want to discuss their announcement of the Ecosystem Restoration Fund. We're very, very grateful, and thank you to Inger also for her leadership and prioritization of Pakistan's crisis right now. It, of course, has to be addressed as a multisectoral crisis. It has to be kept out of silos. As you say, and I want to thank both our partners, UNDP and FAO, for their ability in Pakistan to respond to my demands, which is what they were, and we worked as friends. So it's been a good experience. I hope we can continue that. But I do want all pilots and experiments scaled up. I do not want our development partners coming in and saying, not you, but there are many, including the private sector blended finance ones, that coming in and there's a little project here, there's a little project there. The box gets ticked to head offices, and it's not scaled up to make a difference on the ground. So that's something that we need to change. We pick one big initiative or one small one, but pick one and go with it and make a transformative change on the ground. That should be the endeavor. And we should obviously do it collectively. No one agency can sometimes do it, but your support in bringing the funds that can projectize it, which you can supervise and do yourselves if you like, will at least give this a kickstart. Will create the Velcro in which the investors can look in with their own interests. Everybody has their own interests. So, and now that Yannick, my friend from the Green Climate Fund, is here, I just want to say, we need your support, as we have depended on it in the past, but we need Green Climate Fund and the entire climate funding associated with your fund to grow its ability to respond with speed, to look at reviews faster than it does, and you have been saying that you're doing this, so we appreciate that. But we need now to access funds with speed, agility, and scale. Now, if the GCF is going to say that we are maxed out for 2023 for Pakistan, where do we stand? Where does the most climate vulnerable country this year in the world turn to if green funding is not available? Sorry? You're not maxed up. He just said that. The man just spoke. No, so build in your own monitoring, evaluation, come in as you like, give us, in fact, we would prefer technical capacity coming in and not ghost technical capacity and not delayed technical capacity. By ghost, I mean, there's a phenomenon all over South Asia, there are ghost teachers in schools. They're registered as teachers, but already there. So we often get ghost technical people, not from you, but, from people. And they're there in our offices, but they're not really there. They're on paper somewhere. So we want real technical capacity. We want people working on the ground. We are building our own adaptation plan right now. We would appreciate assistance, because without without an adaptation plan that responds to local needs, really there's going to be no adaptation. And the kind of challenge we face is, I'm a federal minister, we are a highly federated, provincial, autonomized system where I can't even tell the province what to do, whether it's Sindh or Balochistan or Punjab. I have to navigate that as Islamabad, which is the capital, and say, hey, we've built some plans for you. Would you like to, lead from there? Would you like to invest in these? Would you like to use these as your capacity frameworks and guidelines? So the recovery framework has been put together with all 4 provinces. So has the Living Indus. It has the ownership and the involvement of all stakeholders, including communities. I keep saying you can't police climate change, you can't impose it from the top down. It has to be embraced, and those 2 strains meet very well in this project, because we see a great deal of silos. Even government of Pakistan, and our development partners, we all work in silos. It's infamous. And we need to get past that. We need to create the human corrections and say, right, pick up the phone and say, this is sitting on my desk or on my file for 3 months. Help me out here. And I'm going to be calling you, Yannick, for helping us in this one. because it really will get neglected if we put every effort only in what is seen as an infrastructure development. I mean, the river is infrastructure for us. It's old-fashioned, nature-based infrastructure. And it is something that we need to invest in, even in the short term. It's something that, it's a journey that has to begin now while we layer on the recovery, because this is what's going to give communities hope. The fisher folk will come back. Yes, we'll have to, you mentioned the governance of riverbeds. No, somebody mentioned, we have a lot of people living too close to the riverbeds. We have people in KP, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, building right almost in the riverbed, and then they get wiped out. So all of that needs to be, yes, that needs to be policed better, but it's not easy to make entire civilizations move away from the river that nurtured them. They think everybody wants to live and work close to the Indus. And now the Indus is unpredictable in ways that it has never been before. So all rivers are unpredictable, but this one is now become a poster child for climate change in the world, just like us. So I really appreciate the time all of you have brought here, the agency, the focus, and really the rebooting of your compassion, as I keep saying, for creating frameworks for us that will help pave the path for a road countries like Pakistan have not been on. Climate change finds resistors everywhere in the world, even in the developed world. But this particular calamity has made many people wake up and understand that climate change is a reality. My only worry is the accelerated pace of climate change is so hard and fast that the decade, for us, this is the decade. It's not going to be 2050. It's now. We are on the edge of a precipice, and in hurtling forward with the heat rising as it is, and you know, people do ask, we have under 1% of emissions, so we didn't cause this. Yes, our governance gaps must be bridged, but we have to do all of this simultaneously, and no amount of greening, no amount of Indus recovery, no amount of renewables will stop the heat waves. That is a global problem. We've done the calculations. Pakistan can go completely green. It can go completely renewable. The Indus can be back to its health. Well, that's not easy. But the heat wave will continue. So we have to build a shield against it, and this is one of those parts. Thank you.
Yes, every crisis can be an opportunity. And I do hope this 2022 flood creates such a momentum, and we will keep this momentum moving forward. I don't know, Yannick, you want to respond to Minister's request? Yes.
The first good news, Minister, we are not maxed up. We are not maxed up because we have been planning to set aside some resources for Pakistan after our discussion at COP27. We have about $1 billion of pipeline for Pakistan for 2023-2024. It's include $209 million from GCF, and the rest is in co-financing. Co-financing for us is cash. It's not land, love, labor. It's come from the public and private sector. There are at least 2 projects directly aligned with the Indus initiative that's aimed at improving water resource management that I would like to see approved by our boards this year. And we need to work together for that. And so my proposal would be that we send a technical mission to Pakistan during the first quarter 2023. I would say no later than March. And so that we go through every single possible roadblock that could prevent us from achieving this objective, so that at the end of the year, we have something very, very concrete. Like you, we are not a fan of small pilot projects that cannot be scaled up. We are an investment fund. We are the first dedicated climate IFI. Actually, we are at our best for projects anywhere between $250 million to $10 billion. and because our due diligence is right size for this kind of large projects. And so we would like to focus on a limited number of initiatives that can scale up very fast. We are 100% supporting your effort regarding the importance of ecosystem-based approaches to complement grey infrastructure. I would like to applaud the Pakistan and yourself, Minister, because I know that it also reflects your leadership for this effort. For me, there has always been something, a paradox at the heart of the IPCC reports. If you read the IPCC report, if you look at science, basically we should take action. We should have taken action 50 years ago. But if you look at the economic part, there is no reason to take action. Basically, if you look at the economic part, it says that by the end of the century, we might lose 25% to 50% of the GDP. Who cares when by the end of the century, our GDP could be 750% to 900% higher than it is today? So when you look at the piece on economics, you say, okay, the best is that we do nothing. Except that this is assumed the fact that we will build back better, that after every single disaster, we will take the opportunity to build back better, and this will have no lasting impact on the economic development. So we are not to go toward a downward spiral. And actually, it's not true. Every single site I've visited after a major disaster has been built back worse. For example, I visited the Caribbean, and the Caribbean builds the houses with tilted roof. It's good against the wind. All the houses in the aftermath of a hurricane basically are built flat because it's cheaper. But flat and winds is not very good. And I really applaud what you said, Minister, at the beginning. We have to make sure that we do build back better. And we know that we cannot build back better because after humanitarian assistance, there is no more money. There is no more money because your debt to GDP ratio maybe has gone through the roof. You might have lost 50% of your GDP. I think Dominica lost 200% in one day. And so your debt to GDP can reach 100%. Nobody is to give you a penny, not the private sector, not sovereign loans. And you have no fiscal resources, and therefore you do not build back better. It's called for a new type of finance, and where we reduce the risk of immediately investing in the aftermath of a disaster. And we look very, very much forward to working with you, Minister, on reinventing the type of finance we need to build back better, to foster resilience at scale.
Thank you, Yannick, with your music, like the Minister said, very positive response. So with this, we may have to conclude this session. We're a bit over time. But I would like to thank you all for your patience, for your participation. I would like to also thank our panel members for their insight, for their advice, and also for their response to the Minister's request. So thank you. Have a good evening.